So I have prepared a talk for about 45 minutes. I think I'll try and make it sure that I don't dwell on things too long, but it's about my favorite topic, and this is our gut and our brain and how these two things are connected. So this is one of the areas where, oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, there was a bit of static, but you're clear again now.
Okay, great. So, of course, this is an area of research that have seen some unprecedented advances in the last couple of years. And it's really, I think of all of the scientific areas, the gut-brain connection and our microbiome and how our gut interacts with our brain has become one of the most interesting areas in the last 5 years. So, before I start my talk, as I always like to have a little bit of a look at what we call our unique human eating behavior. So humans are very, very unique if you look at us compared to any other animals on Earth. We sit down for meals with other humans, and this is a fundamental aspect of human feeding biology. We process food outside of our bodies, and we go to great lengths, and we spend a lot of money and TV shows to show us how to process food before we eat it. So food is prepared and consumed at a particular time of day in a designated place. We store food and we prepare it to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We usually eat in groups, and we mostly eat peacefully, depending on your family setup, but mostly peacefully. And all of these are really, really unique. No other animals on Earth eat like this, and not even our closest cousins, the great apes, would get together and prepare food in the way that humans do. So for humans, eating is both social and nutritional. And we've evolved to respond and adapt to food shortages. So up until very recently, food was very much or food availability was very much seasonal, and we would eat different types of food in different times of the year. So this is very important to think about. Any of you, if you would actually go and chat to your grandma or grandfather and ask them what they ate when they were young, it was very easy to see how much we have changed in the last 100 years. So there's this general idea that we have a thrifty genotype or a thrifty phenotype, which basically means we are, as humans, very, very good at storing fat, and we are very good at seeking out food that is high in calories, so high in fat and high in sugar. But of course, why do we eat what we eat? And there's various reasons we do this. So I always joke and say this is me at the end of the academic year, when you drown your sorrows in a nice bowl of apple pie in this particular case. But of course, we eat because it tastes good. Eating nice food makes us feel happy. And we also we eat socially. We get together to display status. We often try and impress friends with good food. On colleges, they always compete to see who can buy the best wine. We celebrate almost every major festival in our lives with food. So naming ceremonies, birthdays, weddings, wakes, religious holidays, all of these are marked by the consumption of specific food. And usually in social setups where your entire family get together and you cook these meals, and people often speak very fondly and with great passion about the foods that they had when they were young and the foods that they used to eat at specific family festivals. So usually for humans, our energy intake is usually matched to our energy expenditure over a long period of time. So if you overeat at one part of the year, you usually eat less at the rest of the year. And it's not usual for humans to accumulate a large amount of adipose tissue over a lifetime. But unfortunately, of course, this is something that we're now seeing a lot of. And if you're interested in this topic, this book was written by two doctors at the Mayo Clinic, The Evolution of Obesity, as a great introduction to this field. But essentially, what we see is the metabolic changes in mammals that are fattening up before winter, before they go into a winter sleep, is very similar to the changes that we see in type 2 diabetes in humans. And sort of our genome is interacting with a dramatically changed modern food environment. And as little as 50 years ago, the type of food that you would find on the shelves are very different from what we see now. And obesity is officially classified as a failure to maintain weight homeostasis. So, and a lot of this discussions are around the concept of appetite and satiety and the so-called modern diet. But the modern diet is a combination of a lot of different things. And one of the main issues that people often discuss is that the physical exertion associated with gathering food is no longer a major factor. So we don't longer go out and hunt something, carry it home, and then skin it and cook it. We have easy access to high calorie foods all the time. And the sort of the prediction of the obesity epidemic was already predicted in 1972 by John Yatkin, that was wrote this book Pure, White and Deadly, about the addition of sugar to food. And this is of course because humans have a strong hedonistic drive to eat. Our brains will reward us very, very strongly for eating high fatty, sugary food. So we are also very unique that we can refrain from eating when we are hungry and we can eat when we are not hungry. And this sort of comfort eating or binge eating when you are already full, this is something that's seen almost exclusively in humans. And there remains a question about nutrition versus calories. If you think about a cereal bar that's full of nuts and dates, very, very high calories, but nutritious. There's lots of fibers and micronutrients in there versus a Mars bar that has the same amount of calories but is completely devoid of nutrition. And this is something that's brain registers calories. Your brain cannot detect nutrition. So, and many of the signals that regulate appetite and the motivation to eat is integrated and often confused, even in the media. So, for how long you stay full, satiation, the amount of food you eat, the type of food you pick, and how quickly you feel hungry again. All of these are factors that are different for every individual. We would naturally prefer to have more protein than our next door neighbor, or thinking about eating more. If we're all sitting at a table, all of us will pick different foods. We will eat different amounts of the food. We will stop eating and feel full at different times than other people, and we will also feel hungry again sooner. And all of these are things that contribute to our unique eating behavior. One of the major questions is, why do humans overfeed when we have the chance? All of us overfeed when we're sitting down at a table, you're full, you're given dessert, and you manage to find space for that dessert, even though you're no longer hungry. So the regulation of feeding is complex, and these neural networks are spread over both the primitive and the higher functions of the brain. And it's often this combination of the emotional attachments that we have with food versus the need to consume calories that we find are contradict each other. So the first sort of major paper that alerted the scientific world to the obesity epidemic was this paper by Hiller et al. Published in 2003. And they show that between the time of 1994 and 1999, just in that 3-year period, there was this big shift in the body mass index of Americans from 25 and a whole shift to the right. You can see this red line here. And then it was projected in 2008 to be first shifted even further. And of course, this was far worse actually in 2008. And you can see here that in the 1900s, your standard Homo sapiens woman had a body mass weight of 50 versus 74 today. So, I mean, that is a 24-kilogram difference. And again, men 65 to 86, and again, 21-kilogram difference in this average body mass of a man and a woman. From 100 years ago. So one of the main things that they highlighted, that Hila highlighted, is not this shift that we simply have this blue curve that is shifting to the right, but what we're looking at here is an actual that is hidden under this red curve is actually your normal population that seems to stay at a BMI of 21, 25, which is average. And then you've got this population shown in red, where you have a population that is very susceptible to a modern diet, to a high calorie food, and that seems to be exceptionally good at storing excess calories as fat, and also then being unable to lose that calories or that stored fat, and being unable to regulate their body weight in a normal way. So the obesity epidemic, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, especially the medical students, is that, 1 in 3 middle-aged adults are obese. So people my age, 1 in 3 are obese, 1 in 25 is morbidly obese. Most of Britain is overweight, more than half, and this value actually increased after COVID and the 2 lockdowns. We know a large number of diseases are associated with being overweight. 2 million school children are overweight, with 40 million of these children being younger than the age of 5. Children born to mothers are threefold as likely to become overweight themselves, and 77% of obese children become obese adults. So you do not need any statistics beyond this to know that we need to intervene at school, as school going age. These are the children and the families that we need to help. So up to date, bariatric surgery was the only treatment that showed long-term maintained weight loss. And this is something that I will discuss in a bit more detail later. And when we also look at the current skinny jabs, or Wegovy, as one of the GLP-1 receptor agonists that you can now buy from or get from your local doctor to treat overweight or obesity. But of course, bariatric surgery's success is mainly attributed to the altered physiology of the gut and the hormones secreted by cells in the gut that can tell your brain how much you've eaten and when to stop eating. So just to bring everybody up to speed, of course, hormones, and these are information molecules, and they can take the shape of small peptides or small molecules, but they basically shape and guide human behavior and physiology. All of our physiology is regulated, and many of our decisions and our emotional states are regulated by hormones. And the pathways that regulate energy homeostasis are controlled by a very small number of hormones, or you can even say a surprisingly small number of hormones. And all of these pathways and receptors that regulate hunger and satiety have alternatives. So there is multiple and overlapping functions of these systems. And this is one of the reasons it's been so difficult to develop the magic pill or diet type medication, because if you lock down or switch off one pathway, you usually have another one that can compensate for the loss of that pathway. So, Roux-en-Y gastric bypass surgery is a procedure where the stomach is basically dissected away, and you have this small part of the stomach remains, and is joined to the small distal small intestine. And what was remarkable with this specific type of weight loss surgery, it was a type of surgery mostly adopted by Americans. So in America, they treated obesity surgically very early on, and a majority of the information we got were from American studies. And you can see as little as 10 years ago, this is 2013, it became very apparent that Roux-en-Y bypass surgery led to this miraculous metabolic U-turn. So patients with morbidly obese diabetic patients will have a re-emergence of insulin sensitivity within 48 hours post-surgery. And this is, of course, way beyond any weight was lost. So that was unrelated to weight loss. You would just have this magic reappearance of insulin sensitivity in these insulin-resistant patients. And of course, this was contributed to the exaggerated release of gut hormones and mostly GLP-1. So GLP-1 is the hormone that helps insulin to be released from the pancreas. And one of the so what the Roux-en-Y bypass patients specifically reported is that they had changes in their eating behavior. So Roux-en-Y bypass was very successful. Patients lose weight and they keep it off, which is really important, for over 10 years. And these studies are now updated for the last 15 years. So for 82, it's 92% of patients is the new statistics that just came out of patients have a remission in their type 2 diabetes. They don't need to go back onto medication. But most importantly, patients report eating behavioral changes. They lose the drive to overeat and they go from sweet tasting food to preferring bitter or salty taste instead. And they also report stopping, they stop obsessing about food. And these findings was extremely surprising because it's very difficult to understand how the anatomical rearrangement of the gut could have neurological effects and how this could actually affect the way that your food preferences and the food that you love. This is very unusual and was very unexpected. There are some side effects of Roux-en-Y bypass. Some patients develop osteoporosis, and also some patients have an increased susceptibility to develop a dependence on alcohol. And this hints very strongly that the reward systems and the systems that drive preference and reward is disrupted in obese patients. So Roux-en-Y bypass is mainly, so the effects on feeding behavior was very poorly understood. People really scratched their heads about this. But what is interesting is that obesity is usually now seen as a reward deficiency state with a resultant overeating that takes place. So if you look at the little section of your brain, I'm just showing you a little picture here, you can see basically that sensitized wanting centers lead to increased motivation to acquire food. So on the one side, you really, really crave food and you have these oversensitized wanting centers. And this is coupled with blunted reward responses to palatable foods. And if you see over here, I had these sort of little smiley faces. Your dopamine D2 receptors are the ones that signal reward responses in humans. When you've just eaten a bar of high quality Belgian chocolate, you have a lot of input from your dopamine receptors that tell you this was really good. But of course, people that have, or patients with lower dopamine D2 receptors have tend to be weigh more and have a higher BMI, body mass index. So this is very clear that there is some reward deficiency state that is involved with patients that are very obese. And if you can bear with me, I know this is a bit of a complicated slide, but I only want to show you that if you look at the human brain, you have this tiny little part of the human brain called the arcuate nucleus. And in that tiny little part of the brain resides your circuits that regulate hunger and satiety. And on the one side, you've got this duplicates, this sort of yin and yang situation where your hunger circuits is driven by your NAG neurons, and these called NPY, agouti-related peptide, and GABAergic neurons. And the NAG neurons, I always think about your nagging sense of hunger. So these neurons are activated by all of the hormones that make you feel hungry. While on the other hand, the POMC and CART neurons signal satiety, and all of the hormones that make you feel full signal through this. And you can see if you have a failure in satiety signals coming in through your POMC CART neurons, you're going to feel hungry all the time. And it's usually when you see a disruption in these two signal pathways that you have disrupted eating habits. And you can see over here, so you've got your tiny little arcuate nucleus over there, but it receives signals from your stomach, from your liver, from your spleen, from your not spleen, guys, sorry, your pancreas. Please don't quote me. Your pancreas, definitely, and of course leptin, which is adiponectin, which are hormones that come in from your adipose tissue. So many, many, many signals impact on your satiety and your hunger signals in this tiny, tiny region of your brain. And then, of course, in 2020, so as little as 4 years ago, the first paper by Kimberly Steele was published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation. I was very excited when I saw this paper. And I teach it to our third-year medical students. We're going through this paper in quite a lot of detail. But what Kimberly did in this paper, they had a look at the neural responses that patients have before and after bariatric surgery to milkshakes. And these are milkshakes that were made up from different concentration of sugar and fat. So they were either a little bit bland and thin or really, really sweet and creamy. And they then had a look at the activity in the ventral tegmental area, so the VTA. So the VTA is the area of your brain that regulates reward. And this is reward consumption, learning, memory, and also addiction behavior. And this specifically through dopamine. So you know those little smiley faces I showed you in the previous slide? So this was the area where your dopamine receptor activity can be measured. And they then was able to show that Roux-en-Y bypass surgery produced a reduced liking for sugar sweetened mixtures. And these are exactly what the patients were actually reporting for all these years, that their like for sweet tasting things changed. They also showed that the greater preference you had for sweetened for sugar before the surgery, the more weight you lost after the surgery. And also the individuals who showed a lower taste-induced activation of the reward circuits before surgery had greater changes in the reward activation afterwards. So in other words, Roux-en-Y bypass surgery somehow reset the neural processing of the reward stimuli. And this is by rescuing blunted activation in these areas that are involved with reward. And this was the first hard evidence to show that the anatomical rearrangement of the gut somehow resulted in altered electrical activity of the areas of your brain that regulate reward. And this was therefore a very, very important paper. But of course, if we look here at a picture of and of course, this is a mouse brain. I hope you can tell the difference. But just to give you a very small idea, so we were just talking about a little section of the brain over here. But of course, the vagus nerve itself that regulates the gut signals back to the NTS, the back of the brain. So this is more the primitive brain that is controlled by short-term feeding signals, such as all of the hormones that come from the gut. But of course, leptin and adiponectin are hormones secreted from our adipose tissue that's supposed to tell your brain that you are well fed. So is insulin. And so you can see we've got a large number of signals, all of them coming in to try and tell your brain how well fed or hungry you are. So one of the major challenges in the future is to understand how all of these different systems synchronize to regulate appetite and metabolism. And if we look at our incretin hormone, so this is one of the major gut hormones that is upregulated by Roux-en-Y bypass surgery. This is called GLP-1. So GLP-1 is secreted from enteroendocrine cells, and these are actually called L cells in the gut. And you can see this is the colon, and you can see this is a lovely little histological slide showing these little cells as highlighted in green lit up here. So usually these cells are, they're little cone shaped with a fat basolateral side secreting the hormone into the circulation where the hormone travels to a receptor and has an effect. And as I mentioned, it enhances insulin secretion from pancreatic beta cells, but it also suppresses appetite because it tells your brain that you've eaten enough, and it also helps with insulin sensitivity. So this is one of the major hormones that is the target for some of the therapies and anti-obesity therapies on the market today. But of course, this picture is a very old-fashioned one. It's actually a picture from my lab about 10 years ago. But then some of the groundbreaking work that came in this field, and mainly due to technical advances in this field, have shown some really, really interesting different ways of looking at these little cells. So you can see how old, in this case, There was a fantastic paper published showing a technique called 3D, three-dimensional electron microscopy. And you can really look at cells on cellular level in great detail. And what they did is they had a piece of gut that they cut in one after the other, almost like little slices of toast stacked on top of each other. And then they visualized the entire three-dimensional landscape of these cells. And this was in 2014, where they showed for the first time that yes, you do have your little gut endocrine cells in your gut villi. You can see here's villi of the small intestine going up. But then they started to see that not all the cells had just had these little cone shapes, but some of these cells seem to make a direct connection with the nerves. And it was only in 2014 that we realized for the very first time that our gut endocrine cells, and they called them little neuropods, actually form a direct physical connection with your nervous system. So your gut is literally attached to your brain. And they then, at the same lab, so this was from Roger Little's lab and Diego Borges, that showed that using a green fluorescent rabies virus. So rabies viruses are very unique. They can only jump into neurons, which of course explains the neurological effects if you have rabies. But in this case, they attached a green dye or green fluorescent protein, and they could see if the mice were given a little enema that the actual infection would travel all the way down into the nervous system. So this was the first time that it was unequivocally shown that the gut endocrine cells make a direct physical contact with the rest of your central nervous system. They then went a step further a couple of years later, 2018, and they showed that your gut is not only directly connected to the nervous system, shown here in green, but it travels all the way up your vagus nerve to the base of the brain. And you essentially had an uninterrupted circuit between the gut and the brain. And I have to say, when I first saw this paper, you think twice before you eat a piece of horrible, 4-day-old muffin wrapped in plastic. It is one of those things that you realize there is a direct connection between your gut and your brain. And this is where it starts to make sense that why the Roux-en-Y bypass patients were reporting all these changes. Because if you change the way that your gut is wired substantially, of course, the message to your brain is going to be altered. And they then also went a step further. Oh, sorry, this is just another slide to show you all these beautiful pictures to show that there is a very clear link all the way from the gut endocrine cell, all the way up the vagus nerve to the base of the brain. But they then went a step further. The gut can actually tell the difference between real sugar and sweetener. And this is driven by your enteroendocrine cells of the gut. And they did electrical recordings to look at the electrical activity of the neurons before and after these mice were given sugar or the mice were given a sweetener or non-calorific sweetness. And your brain can tell the difference. Your tongue may think both things are sweet, but your brain knows which one contains calories and which one doesn't. And your brain reward you for eating sugar, but not for eating sweetener. And we thought we could sneak this past the brain, right? But what's lovely is they did a very interesting technique where they use a technique called photo optics, where they could silence the electrical activity of the gut cell and then show that there were no electrical activity in the brain. So they unequivocally show that there was a direct electrical circuit between your gut and your brain, and where the arrival of sugar will trigger different electrical currents than the arrival of artificial sweetener. So, of course, I'm not going to discuss all the graphs. It is just for those of you that would be interested in having a look at this paper. As to the new anti-obesity drug. And of course, this drug has had huge success. It is one of the major breakthroughs in the last century in our fight against obesity, and it has helped a large number of obese diabetic patients come on top of their diabetes. And of course, these are GLP-1 receptor agonists. And it's called Wegovy in America. I think it is semaglutide in the UK, but it's generally sort of referred to as the skinny jab. So it has a lot of advantages. And there's also, we are now looking at the development of even more powerful GLP-1 receptor agonists. We're looking at agonists that target receptors for glucagon and also GIP, which is one of the other hormones that help with insulin release. And what's important here is that if you have a triple agonist, you're looking at the weight loss that is similar to that of bariatric surgery. So finally, in 2023, 2024, we can now chemically mimic the same things that we saw with Roux-en-Y bypass surgery. There are, of course, many side effects. But if you look at morbidly obese diabetic patients with final stage complications, the benefits from taking this drug far outweighs any of the risks that are associated with taking this drug. But GLP-1 receptors are everywhere in the body, and they have a very far-reaching impact. So I teach endocrinology for medical students, and as an endocrinologist looking at this, you do feel a little bit uneasy knowing that people are taking a drug that can impact almost every system in the body. And that brings me to a study this was 2021, and this study was run by Novo Nordisk, and they had a look at patients where they have patients taking a placebo, patients taking the GLP-1 receptor agonist liraglutide, patients doing exercise shown in green, and then exercise and liraglutide or drug shown in red. And you can see that what the study basically did is they had patients on a very, very strict diet of about 800 calories per day. And of course, everybody lost a lot of weight. But you can see that patients that did exercise and that used the drug lost a similar amount of weight. And of course, the combination is excellent, while the placebo stayed the same. But what's important here, if you look at this graph called your general health perception, what's interesting, while the patients were starving and losing a huge amount of weight, they felt really good, which is very ironic, actually. But what's very interesting is that patients taking the placebo in gray or patients taking the drug in blue felt equally felt the same. None of them felt as good as they did when they were on the starvation diet. And very interestingly, is both the patient groups that had exercise included felt a lot better. Their general health perception was better. And this is one of the things that I think should really receive more attention, and that's the health benefits of exercise. And you can see that exercise or exercise and the drug have similar effects. These patients feel better. And I think this addresses an issue that is often glossed over, because a morbidly obese patient, of course, is overweight and has metabolic issues or comorbidities, but these patients are often lonely and they are often isolated, and they need support. They need to meet people, and simply giving somebody a drugs to make them thinner would not necessarily look at the social economic aspects of these patients. A similar study, again, that uses just diet, you can see similar thing. Patients were given a starvation diet, and this was a liquid diet. These things are horrible. They taste absolutely awful, but they put you on an 800 calorie per day liquid diet for 12 to 20 weeks. You lose a magnificent amount of weight during this time. And you can see then food was reintroduced over the next couple of weeks and maintained up to 12 months. This was no exercise and this was no drug. Simply going on a diet has a similar effect. So again, delivering this sort of treatment to patients that live far away from health centers is hard. But of course, we know that there's now a very, very well established relationship between your access to green and blue spaces. So the further away you live from a park or a leisure center or have access to a pool, the more likely you are to be depressed and have type 2 diabetes and be obese. And this is a social economic aspect of obesity that I think is not being addressed by simply going to the doctor and getting a jab for your obesity. And I think that this is something that is really important and that needs attention from the health sector that wants to treat diabetic patients in the long run. So if we can quickly look at what is some of our future perspectives, so what is really new and what's coming up. So of course, the issue of epigenetics. And what this says is that the metabolic state of your mother or father during conception or post-birth when you were growing up has an impact on your metabolic state. And this is absolutely true. A very large component of obesity is genetic, and it has a very strong genetic basis. And one of the papers was published in Cell Metabolism, had a very clear answer to show where they looked at men before and after bariatric surgery, and they looked at the way that the DNA in their sperm was altered. And it was very clear that the receptors, and if you remember, this is your little satiety, hunger and satiety circuit in the arcuate nucleus of your brain, and there were genes on both sides of the circuit that were altered, whose expression was altered by bariatric surgery. And we now understand that it's the metabolic state of the father has a large impact on the genetic inheritance of their offspring. A very interesting paper that came out very recently in June last year was one of the first papers to directly link food deprivation and heritable behavior patterns in the first generation. So first and foremost, I have to point out, of course, this is in worms. So, we can't extrapolate science that from worms into humans. But nonetheless, I think this is an exceptionally interesting paper. Because what the scientists basically did is they hatched eggs that they then moved the little worms into dishes with a specific odor, and they were starved while they were exposed to this odor. And then they were given food and recovered on food with no odor. So these worms were trained to associate starvation with this particular odor. And you can see that for first and foremost, that of course, these worms, the P0 or the parents, avoided the area, or they avoided the area that smelled of starvation, essentially. And you can see over here that the F1 generation, without having been trained, also avoided the areas that smelled of starvation, but not the F2 generation. So the children, but not the grandchildren. But what I find particularly interesting is that avoidance behavior could not be easily unlearned. And in the parents, you could see that refeeding them, when they were exposed to the odor in the presence of food, would still avoid that area. And you can see the second, third, it's only by the fourth time that they realize, okay, there is food here, even though it smells bad. So it was after 3 refeedings they finally unlearned. But what was very interesting is that memory extension was not possible in the F1 generation. It didn't matter how many times you gave them food in the presence of that odor, they would always avoid the areas where that odor is. They could not unlearn this association. And I think this is although it's done on worms, it's a very important paper when we think about long-term treatment of or entrenchment of eating behaviors in mammals. And last but not least, if we look at the social side of eating, so there was recently, of course, a lot of comments on the weight loss drugs. And many of them say, if this anti-obesity drug put me off my dinner, I won't eat it. And I love this piece that was written by Leila Latif, where she said that food had been a fundamental part of my identity. You know, my mother was a brilliant cook and she taught me how to bake. I fell in love with my husband over themed evenings, you know, and food in my family was our shared love language. You know, and she talks with great affection of how her grandmother used to haggle for fruit and how her father was able to find the best vegetables. And of course, it really makes you, and of course, no, you don't understand the country until you've eaten their food. And I mean, this always made me really sad when I read when she said, you know, she now cooking is just a mercenary task, and she, you know, she practices her knife skills or catch up on a podcast, but she's completely lost the interest in food. And she said, I discover I can still take some pleasure in eating things connected to treasured memories. And I think it would be a really sad day when we no longer sit down to eat cake. You know, when we no longer get together to eat and enjoy food. Because I think we form very strong emotional bonds with the food we eat when we are surrounded with people we love and we are in places where we feel valued and safe. And this is the social aspect of eating that we should not underestimate when we're taking drugs that basically eliminates our enjoyment of food. And just a little bit on the other side of things, if I'm not sure if any of you have ever seen any of the Korean mukbang. So mukbang is also known by translates as a eating show, and this is something that was popular in the early 2010s. But I, of course, came to contact with this first during lockdown when I was sort of doing a bit of research on eating behavior. And of course, you know, got worldwide millions and millions of followers watching these beautifully manicured men and women constantly eat food in front of a camera and making you, you know, telling you how it tastes like and crunching so you can hear how it sounds like when they eat it. And of course, this is believed to be a result of increased feelings of isolation and loneliness in people, that you basically log on to eat with someone and to experience eating at a table with someone. And this is a sort of that there's a loss of culture of eating together socially in groups, and this void is being filled with this particular YouTube sensation. And this last but not least, I think I've got 5 minutes. I just want to then, of course, what we sort of course, you know, the actual elephant in the room is that a large number of people that are taking anti-obesity drugs are not actually obese. And in the UK, the majority of people who are buying and using these anti-obesity drugs are people of normal BMI that wants to be skinnier. And there was a fantastic exhibition in the Wellcome collection, The Cult of Beauty, where they looked at, of course, at beauty through the ages. And you can see in the back here these very chubby ladies, all of them obviously the most beautiful women you could find in an era when the majority of people were starving. And of course, today, when everybody tends to be overweight and food is plenty, we look at people, we think we're beautiful when we're really skinny. And one of the issues, of course, when I spoke about side effects, if an obese diabetic patient take these drugs, there's no issue even thinking the side effects is doesn't weigh very heavily because, of course, the health benefits far outweighs any side effects that the drug cause. But if it's a person of normal BMI that's essentially healthy take these drugs, the side effects can be very severe. And there's a big increase in the diagnosis of pancreatitis, which is typically something you develop when you take these drugs when you are not overweight. So in conclusion, I love this saying by Jean Brulliat-Savarin. So he said, tell me what you eat and I will tell you what you are. He was a French writer, lawyer and politician, and I think he was really the first sort of mukbang artist out there. But he wrote the most fantastic books about reflection on the crafts and the science of cookery and the art of eating. And I think, you know, instead with our personal and our complicated relationship with food that sustain us, you know, our body has a very intricate network of electrically excitable cells. And we have an uninterrupted circuit from our gut to the brain that is sensitive to the food we eat. And these electrical circuits convert the food into signals which coordinate gut motility, the secretion of hormones, food intake, food preferences, metabolism, mood, and behavior. And enjoying food is universal and it transcends all cultural, social, and religious boundaries. And eating together in groups is really a fundamental aspect of human behavior that I think it will be a great tragedy if this is lost. But the questions that we really need to answer if we want to treat obesity effectively is to understand the mechanisms which drive food intake, or why food, the factors that makes food look appealing, and why do we prefer different tastes and colors and textures, and also why these mechanisms are disrupted in morbidly obese diabetic patients. So I will stop there and I can take some questions.